Question, Lisa Nandy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State to make a statement regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A tragedy is unfolding in the Middle East. Israel has suffered the worst terror attack in its history, and Palestinian civilians are experiencing a devastating and growing humanitarian crisis. As the Foreign Secretary made clear, last week's agreement was a crucial step towards providing relief to the families of the hostages and addressing the humanitarian emergency in Gaza. This pause has provided an opportunity to ensure that much greater volumes of food, fuel and other life-saving aid can enter Gaza. On the 24th of November, the British government announced a further £30 million worth of humanitarian assistance, tripling our existing aid budget for the occupied Palestinian territories this financial year, bringing it to a total of £60 million. During the pause, the fourth UK aircraft carrying 23 tonnes of humanitarian aid for Gaza arrived in Egypt, bringing the total amount of UK humanitarian aid provided by British aircraft to 74 tonnes. That aid is now being dispersed to the United Nations to support critical food, water, health, shelter and protection needs in Gaza and to preposition emergency supplies in the region. And we are also, Madam Deputy Speaker, actively exploring other aid routes, including by sea. The pause that ended last week was a crucial step towards providing relief to the families of the hostages and addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We have said repeatedly that we'd like to see an extension. UK humanitarian funding will continue to support trusted partners to provide humanitarian assistance and negotiate humanitarian access in Gaza. The UK will continue, in conjunction with our international partners, to advocate internationally on humanitarian priorities. These include respect for international humanitarian law, the need for fuel, humanitarian access, humanitarian pauses, and an increase in the types of assistance. We are urgently exploring all diplomatic options to increase this, including urging Israel to open other existing land borders, such as Kerem Shalom. We welcome the intensive international cooperation, including efforts from Qatar and the USA, that led to this agreement, and we thank partners for their continued work. We remain committed to making progress towards a two-state solution. Britain's long-standing position on the Middle East peace process is clear. We support a negotiated settlement leading to a safe and secure Israel living alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. The UK will continue to work with all partners in the region to reach a long-term political solution that enables both Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace.
Shadow Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given recent events, it is surprising and regrettable that neither the Prime Minister nor the Foreign Secretary are making a statement today. The reality is that this conflict has sadly reached another phase, and many more innocent lives will be lost if we do not act now. We urge the Government to continue to push for another cessation of hostilities and for all remaining hostages to be freed. And to be clear, Israel must not besiege or blockade Gaza. It must comply with international law and protect innocent lives and civilian infrastructure, and ensure attempts to address the humanitarian catastrophe are ramped up quickly. In the last few days, partners on the ground have become increasingly concerned about the safe zone at Al-Mawasi. Reports suggest aid is not reaching those there. Has the government held talks with Israel and others to ensure that it does, and to seek assurances that Palestinians who fled there will not be moved further still, which he will know is a key concern of Arab states? Shelters are severely overcrowded, dysentery is spreading, and the risk of cholera is now significant. That must be mitigated now. Is there a serious plan to deal with sewage and distribute medicine and vaccines? It is winter in Gaza. Nearly 2 million people are displaced, many in tents or in the open air. I urge the Minister, again, to follow the US's lead and appoint a humanitarian coordinator to get the trucks moving more quickly, to get fuel in and to work towards the opening of Kerem Shalom. The UK and partners must redouble efforts towards an enduring cessation of hostilities and a lasting political solution. Israel must be assured that Hamas cannot carry out an attack like October the 7th ever again, but to build a lasting peace, we must assure a generation of Palestinians there's hope, that they, their children and grandchildren can expect the security and opportunity that is their right, with a plan for children both to prevent their deaths and to prioritise their lives, and a clear message that there can be no reoccupation or reduction of Gazan territory and that those displaced have the right to return home. I urge the government to play its part in ending the illegal settlements and settler violence in the West Bank and create a plan for the reconstruction and renewal of Gaza. We must do more without delay to deal with the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in front of us as we work simultaneously towards a better future. Many more lives will be lost if we do not act now.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful for the constructive tone of my counterpart, and we are in agreement. We are pushing for a further pause. We regard this as imperative. The success, as it were, of the last one showed the utility of a pause in terms of the increased flow of humanitarian support, and we continue to strain every sinew in terms of our diplomacy to aim for that. The Foreign Secretary made that argument to his various ministerial colleagues last week, and will continue to do that with his counterpart and ministerial counterparts right across the Middle East. She mentioned the safe zone. That is something we continue to monitor, and officials in the region are seeing how that unfolds with regard to the humanitarian impact. But she's absolutely right when she draws the House's attention to the grievous impact in terms of the humanitarian impact of disease. We are confident that the way we are channeling our funds through the UN agencies is the right way to go about that. That's the UNRWA, OCHA and UNICEF. But of course, the scale of increase of need is something that's hugely alarming, and we are very painfully aware that it is women and children who often bear the most unfortunate brunt of this sort of impact. We are redoubling efforts, I can give her that assurance. Clearly our financial contribution has tripled, but that goes in hand with our political efforts, because it is only through a lasting peace that she referred to that this will be resolved. The humanitarian component, Madam Deputy Speaker, is clearly of utmost urgency, but we must not forget the political, which runs in tandem. And our stance when it comes to the illegal settlements in the West Bank, and our continued support, our long-standing support for a sustainable solution that sees Palestinian statehood at the heart of the future of the region is undiminished. And that's something that, in addition to our humanitarian efforts, our political effort and our diplomatic effort will continue to argue for Palestinian statehood as the seed for a long-term solution in the region.
Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the House will welcome the bipartisan support for what the British Government is trying to do. Most of us know that our direct power in the area ended over 70 years ago. Can I, through the Minister, put to those who just want to have a simple ceasefire that would be helped a permanent end to violence if people around Israel recognised Israel within its recognised international boundaries, and if Israel could make sure it could withdraw to its own boundaries and stop the aggressive settler activity outside their own areas in the West Bank.
Speaker, the Father of the House makes a very, very good point. Our analysis is that the two-state solution, in which both sides respect the right of each other to exist, and there's an end to settlement and settler violence, is an essential precondition to any long-term peace in the region.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Madam Deputy Speaker, exactly as they said they would at the end of the humanitarian pause, Israel has resumed its offensive in Gaza with full force, including an appalling attack on the MSF aid convoy, and official figures estimate that 1,000 Palestinians were killed this weekend alone. There is a massacre of innocent civilians taking place right now, and it's blatantly obvious that all appeals made by the UK government and others for Israel to avoid civilian casualties are being ignored. And I wonder just how much this government now regrets giving Netanyahu that blank cheque, particularly as millions of displaced people are being squeezed into a wasteland on the Egyptian border and the indiscriminate bombing continues. At the weekend, the EU's foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, echoed Scotland's First Minister when he said that the solution can only be political, one which is centred on two states. And he's correct. So can I ask the Minister, what is holding the UK Government back from officially recognising the state of Palestine as a fundamental first step to achieving a long-term solution to this awful crisis?
You're here.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful for the contribution by the Honourable Gentleman. Of course, we are painfully aware of the tragic and significant human impact, especially with regards to civilian casualties of the military operation. But to simplify it to the degree that forgets that Hamas is the terrorist group that is prosecuting atrocities, we must see, frankly, the civilian casualties as a product of the terrible conflict that has resulted because of the Hamas terrorist atrocity on the 7th of October. We continue to argue very strongly and make the point to Israel that military operations must be conducted according to humanitarian law and avoiding civilian casualties. And he made a point about the two-state solution. Clearly, one of the major obstacles to this two-state solution is Hamas itself. This is a terrorist group that is committed to the destruction of Israel, and if Hamas were in charge, there would be no two-state solution. So a necessary prerequisite is the evolution of a better form of Palestinian leadership in Gaza.
Kit Malthouse.
Madam Deputy Speaker, if the RAF can fly surveillance planes over the Gaza Strip in the much-needed search for hostages and to help in their release, what is to stop us flying cargo planes over and parachuting food and medicines to a starving population?
Well, my honourable friend will have heard in my opening statement that a very significant tonnage of humanitarian aid has been delivered via UK aircraft, 74 tonnes currently. So I think we are redoubling that, and we are looking also I think greater utility lies in the assessment as to whether or not there can be a maritime route for an increase in humanitarian supply.
Chair of the International Development Select Committee, Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the responses the Minister is giving, but I actually want to hear the Foreign Secretary's response. We had a session with the humanitarian organisations on the ground in Gaza on the 16th of November. It was harrowing. We wrote to the Foreign Secretary. We've not had a reply. We've not had a reply about when he's going to come in front of our committee. So with such a horrific and fast-moving situation happening in Israel and Gaza, when can this House expect to hear from the Foreign Secretary?
I'm sure it will be very soon, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Andrew Percy.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the idea that settlements are the reason there is not a two-state solution is just complete and utter tosh, Madam Deputy Speaker. The reason there is not a two-state solution is because Hamas seek the total genocide and ethnic cleansing of the state of Israel. They seek to murder every single Jew. They use the most awful sexual violence against women on October the 7th. Some of those reports we read in shocking detail in the Times this weekend. Not a word at the dispatch boxes from either side so far of the message of the information of abuse of hostages who have been released, or a condemnation of this particular violence. That is why there has not been a two-state solution. So can the Minister confirm that this government will continue to stay strong and support Israel in all of its activities to root out this murderous terrorist cult?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't know if my honourable friend heard my previous answer, in which I said that a principal blockage to a two-state solution was Hamas itself. It is a terrorist group that has committed the most heinous terrorist act, and we are therefore we continue to be supportive of Israel defending its people and its security.
Ben Bradshaw. Sir Ben.
Palestinians have lost all hope of a two-state solution thanks to the policies of the Netanyahu government in recent years. And would it not give them some hope if we followed other countries' lead and honoured the vote taken in this House 9 years ago to recognise Palestinian statehood?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think our efforts are focused on a more pragmatic avenue of working with allies in the region to ensure that there's a sustainable, more meaningful support right across the region for a two-state solution.
Sir Julian Lewis.
The government accepts that there can be no political solution unless Hamas is removed from control in Gaza. can the Minister explain to us who exactly will remove Hamas from that level of control in Gaza?
The political future of the Palestinians is a matter for Palestinians.
Leila Moran.
Speaker, I'd like to start by agreeing with the member opposite who spoke about the condemnation, the rightful condemnation of the genocidal words from Hamas. This is the extremes of the debate, and on the other side of the extremes of the debate are ministers in the Israeli government calling for a dropping of a nuclear bomb on Gaza, calling the siege of Gaza and the spread of epidemics as a good thing. These extremes do not represent where the majority of Palestinians and Israelis and the population across the world want to be, which is with this government on two states. My question is simple, however. Two states is all very well to say, but what is the FCDO, in terms of its resources, actually doing to make it happen? Nothing.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, our considerable resource by way of humanitarian aid and political and diplomatic effort is entirely focused on that, and we bring a considerable diplomatic heft in terms of our relationships across the region. We are an important member of the permanent P5 of the Security Council, so we mustn't underestimate our own ability to bring positive political leverage to this situation, and that is something we are resolutely focused on.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, over the weekend, the Times newspaper carried chilling testimony of Hamas's extreme violence against women on the 7th of October. Gang rape, women found with bloodied underwear, broken bones from rape, beheading, women found with gunshots to their private parts. It doesn't bear thinking about what Israeli women held in Hamas captivity have endured and may still be enduring now, those hostages. So will my right honourable friend join me in condemning these appalling acts of violence and this aspect of the ongoing humanitarian situation? And does he also acknowledge that Hamas terrorists have spoken in custody quite openly of their orders to rape and defile women?
I would agree with my right honourable friend that these are deeply shocking reports. These are sadly and very painfully characteristic of the kind of terrorist violence that we've come to expect from Hamas, and whilst they are shocking, we deeply condemn them.
Commissioner Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week I had the opportunity to visit Qatar with the parliamentary delegation. We met with Dr. Al-Ansari, one of the official spokesperson involved with the negotiations for hostage release and the temporary humanitarian truce, with Egypt, US, Israel and others. What was clear was that this was a fragile truce that required greater pressure from the international community on all relevant parties, from the Middle East countries like Qatar on Hamas, from the US and the UK on the Israelis, to bring an end to this bloodshed. What is our government doing as a permanent member of the UN Security Council and as a G7 member to use its powers to ensure that there is work done to bring an end to the bloodshed, to ensure that there is work being done to bring a permanent ceasefire? That is what people need, of all backgrounds, of all communities. We need a peace-building process. We need our government to act. What is our government doing?
Speaker, we continue to use all levers at our disposal to argue for another humanitarian pause. Regretfully, discussion of a ceasefire, it seems, is premature given that Hamas is committed to the destruction of the State of Israel. So we are resolutely committed to another humanitarian pause, and we're using all means that are available to us to argue for it.
Can I remind the Minister of the words of the Prime Minister at Mansion House? He said the UK will act to shape the world, not be shaped by it. And I raised that point to the Minister. With regards to the loss of lives that we've seen across the board, we have to do everything we can to preserve human lives. And I've supported, at the very early stage, humanitarian pauses to do that. But the time has come for the UK to take a lead at the UN as a member of the Security Council. Lead at the Security Council. Call for a ceasefire. With regards, we all have our own views in this matter. Having supported humanitarian pauses before, a time has come for the UK to work towards work towards a ceasefire, release of all the hostages, humanitarian assistance and a political solution in line with our own Security Council Resolution 242 on the 67 borders. When will we push that at the Security Council and lead the world on this matter?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are continuing to shape the outcome. We are continuing to shape the outcome, and for us, the most pragmatic and useful outcome at the moment is to argue strongly for a further humanitarian pause.
Sir Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If every humanitarian pause is simply a prelude to the further bombing by Israel of Gaza, what will be left other than a refugee camp and a wasteland? And who does the Minister think will govern that?
Well, he makes a good point. Of course, every civilian death is a tragedy, and the House is painfully aware of the human cost of the unfolding tragedy. As I said, aside from military operations, the political future and the way that Palestinians represent themselves, that is a question for Palestinians.
Mark Pritchard.
I welcome the government's support of the extension of the humanitarian pauses so that more aid can get into Gaza and more lives can be saved. Can I ask the Minister on post-conflict governance in Gaza? I mean, Fatah are not Hamas and Hamas are not Fatah, clearly, by definition. And Fatah are marginally better in the eyes of some Palestinians. But when they've gone to the ballot box, the Palestinians have not voted for Fatah, they voted for others. And I noticed that there have been a lot of high-level diplomatic visits to the senior leadership of Fatah. And can I just encourage the government to perhaps look more widely at who might form the governance of Gaza in the future, and for the UK not to repeat the mistakes of the past and Fatah to return to office only to be thrown out years later and perhaps replaced with a new Hamas?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very good point. It would be easy for us to prejudge and second-guess political outcomes in the West Bank or indeed in Gaza, but we won't do that. What we would seek post-conflict, in a post-conflict situation, is a democratic and a democratic renaissance of the ability of Palestinians to represent themselves and govern themselves responsibly, and we mustn't prejudge or second-guess that.
Joanna Cherry.
Deputy Speaker. Like many other members in this House, I have constituents who are British citizens with family who are trapped in Gaza and desperate for humanitarian visas. One constituent wrote to me at the weekend and she says, "My 79-year-old mother has been displaced 9 times and is now in Rafah. She and her brothers and sisters, who are all British citizens and senior professionals, say they don't want state funds. They can support their family, but surely they can bring their family to the United Kingdom to look after them." That's her 79-year-old mother, her sister and her 6-month-old baby. What can I tell these people about humanitarian visas? And will the Minister lean on the Home Office to address the issue of issuing humanitarian visas?
Speaker, I note with interest her question. If she has a specific case, and I think she's pointed to her constituent with links to Rafah, if she furnishes us with detail, we can pursue that case individually. Thank you.
Baz Elwood.
Madam Deputy Speaker, with the humanitarian pause now closed, the nightmare is back for the remaining hostages and their families, for the Palestinians in desperate need of aid, and also for all civilians on both sides, fearful of what falls from the skies. But with no timeline and no clear plan, the next chapter is likely to be darker and more deadly. Would my right honourable friend agree Israel will not, indeed cannot, resolve the humanitarian, the governance and indeed the security issues alone? The international community has a vital role to play, not least to avoid escalation. So would the UK consider co-hosting an international summit with the United States and other stakeholders to begin the discussions to start to resolve the bigger issues?
Well, Madam Speaker, my right honourable friend makes a very good point. I mean, the international dimension is critical to this, and what's not in doubt is our ability and our intent to use our international diplomatic network and our connections across the region, because the regional approach is hugely important in this. We will endeavour to use our connections throughout the Gulf states and the rest of the Middle East and internationally to seek a just and long-term solution.
Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, what I want, what my constituents want, and what the whole country want, is a stop killing children. Stop killing civilians. They don't know who is the best person to do this or the group of people. But for God's sake, someone stop this killing of children.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman makes a very good point, and of course the images we have seen of civilian deaths have been acutely painful, and we continue to use our relationship with Israel to ensure that they are restrained in terms of their application of force, and also we are forthright in our absolute condemnation of the terrorist atrocity perpetrated by Hamas. And the grotesque effect that it has had on Israelis of all ages.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Despite the humanitarian pause, the majority, 137 hostages, are still held by the terrorists in Gaza. Of those, 2 are children, 10 are over 75, 20 are female, and there's 11 foreign nationals. Clearly, the negotiations broke down with these terrorists over the weekend. So what action is the FCDO taking to make sure that the hostages are freed and returned to their families? Good question.
Well, Madam Speaker, he raises a very good point, and that's front and centre of our diplomatic effort internationally. Clearly, there's a complex web of negotiation effort, which I won't comment on in detail, but we are painfully conscious of the need to exert all of our institutional effort to bring these people home safely.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is unspeakable. 1.8 million now displaced, 33,000 injured, 15,000 dead, over 15,000 dead, and 33,000 injured with hospital beds down to about 1,400 and dropping. My constituent Nora has lost her brother and nephew, who were blown up in their home when they went back when they thought it was safe. Her sister-in-law has lost her limbs. 2 other children are in hospital in intensive care. I need to ask the Minister, what is the plan for humanitarian visas? What is the plan, and how serious is it for safe zones? What is the plan for people who have lost their homes, their family members and their limbs? And what is the plan, seriously, to work with international allies towards a permanent ceasefire, release of hostages and a proper political solution?
She made a good point about the impact on hospitals, and that's why, of course, we've tripled our aid, and we're focused on channeling our aid through the UN agencies that can most effectively help people in hospitals, whether it's by provision of fuel or other supplies. That is the groundwork that will, we hope, eventually unlock the political phase of improving the solution. But it's humanitarian first, with the politics in tandem, and that's what we're also doing.
Andrew Selous.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The sexual violence meted out by Hamas on the 7th of October was absolutely horrendous. In the second half of last month, a number of members on both sides of this House received details passed on by a doctor in Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, who said that 3 of his children and 3 of his grandchildren were among the 45 men, women and children in his house who'd all been destroyed that afternoon while he was working a hospital shift. We are piling misery on misery. So as one former infantry soldier to another, can I ask my honourable friend to make sure the British government renews its plea for as great a precision as possible in the pursuit of the terrorists, so we don't lose more civilian lives in that way?
Madam Deputy Speaker, he speaks with experience and knowledge, and we are making exactly those pleas to our Israeli colleagues.
Ian Paisley.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. 8 weeks after the murder, unjustifiable murder of Jewish people in Israel, the countless raping of Israeli and Jewish women, is the Minister disappointed that the United Nations Women's Group made the most facile and mealy-mouthed statement that could not even use the word rape in describing what had happened? And will he use his influence and the government's influence in drawing the attention of the United Nations to getting on side in this issue and condemning sexual violence against women and the rape of women? Just because they're Jews does not mean that they do not matter,
And that point should be made to the United Nations over and over again.
Madam Deputy Speaker, of course, these reports are shocking. We certainly condemn it. Rape is rape, and we must call it out.
Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The more details we learn of the barbaric attacks of the 7th of October and the treatment of the victims, especially the women, the more horrific it becomes. And one can only imagine at the sheer anguish of the families of the victims go through on a daily basis the more information that comes out. So can my right honourable friend tell me what humanitarian support is being provided to the families of the victims of Hamas?
Well, Madam Speaker, that's a terribly good question, and of course a large proportion of our tripled humanitarian aid budget of £60 million will be channelled through UNICEF and the other two UN agencies, UNRWA and OCHA, a large proportion of which will support women affected by conflict.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sorry, I must press the Minister because I don't feel that he has answered on what the government's strategy is, particularly the political strategy. We all feel it so strongly. No child should ever be the target of a terrorist or in any conflict. So what is the government's political strategy to protect the lives of children?
Our strategy is to exert all effort to bring about peace.
Ryan.
You Minister's growing success in getting aid into Gaza and the tripling of UK aid. But even as my right honourable friend works urgently to get aid in the shortest time possible to the needy civilians of Gaza, will the government also redouble its efforts to bring about a diplomatic solution, perhaps using a contact group, in order that we can grow humanitarian pauses into a just and lasting peace and a two-state solution?
Exactly our strategy is to use diplomatic effort in concert with our humanitarian effort to bring about a situation whereby diplomacy can take effect and the foundations can be laid of a long-term peace. Clearly we are not there yet, but it will require a huge amount of diplomatic effort right across the region and the close relationship with many parties, and that's something to which we can bring a great deal of expertise and utility.
As Shah.
Thank you, Madam. What actions has the government implemented to integrate its approach to preventing atrocities into the UK's foreign and development policies, and how has it involved the Office for Conflict Stabilisation and Mediation's Mass Atrocity Prevention Hub in conducting a risk assessment of Israel's actions in Gaza?
Prevention and the issues you mentioned, they are woven into the fabric of our diplomacy. And they are hugely important in all of our work right across the Middle East, but none more so than the OPC.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Committee for the Protection of Journalists have said that 57 Palestinian journalists have been killed in the Gaza Strip since the 7th of October. They say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that that is the worst period for the killing of journalists since they started keeping records in 1992. Does that not just illustrate the wholly indiscriminate nature of what is being done by the IDF? And will he impress upon the Netanyahu government the complete unacceptability of that situation?
Well, Madam Minister, I don't share his description of wholly indiscriminate. I don't accept that. But of course, I take seriously his note about 57 journalists. That is tragic, but I would take issue with his characterisation as wholly indiscriminate. Of course, we make representations to Israel to constrain and focus their operations, and we will continue to do so.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like so many other members of this House, I received hundreds of emails again this weekend from Newport West constituents who are appalled and horrified at the continuing killing of Palestinian innocent men, women and children. They want the killing to stop. So will the Minister condemn acts of violence and extremism by Israeli settlers in the West Bank and call on the Israeli authorities to prevent settler violence, ensure accountability for perpetrators and condemn extremist rhetoric?
Of course, this government is on record, and I've said it already in this statement, we do condemn, we have condemned settler violence in the West Bank, but we must be very clear that this military operation is underway in Gaza because of the terrorist atrocity carried out by Hamas on the 7th of October. That's the terrible and tragic truth.
Slaughter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now over 15,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza, and Israel's military operations have not abated following the pause in fighting. What specific requests is the government making to its Israeli counterparts to stop the killing? When the minister says a ceasefire is premature, it sounds like a tacit acceptance that disproportionate and indiscriminate destruction of civilian areas is a legitimate means of Israel pursuing its war aims.
A ceasefire would only be possible if Hamas hadn't stated its intent to wipe Israel off the face of the map and to perpetrate another atrocity of the nature of the 7th of October. What we are doing is arguing for a humanitarian pause to bring de-escalation and to allow the further flow of humanitarian aid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I echo the calls for a long-term political solution to this dreadful conflict and an end to the international community, including this government, resigning it to the too difficult pile. Yeah. In the absence of a permanent ceasefire that I'm sure we all want to see, does the Minister recognise and will he reinforce the warnings from the United States and others that Israel's actions in Gaza must be proportionate? Otherwise, they are in clear breach of international law, as the comprehensive amount of evidence from multiple agencies on the ground working in Gaza strongly suggests. I'm sure that he cares deeply about humanitarian issues. So will he join me in rejecting the idea that sending texts or QR codes to advise people to evacuate a war zone when there is no internet and no power to charge phones is wholly inadequate and cannot protect civilians and save innocent lives?
We have called and we continue to call on Israel to abide by international humanitarian law. That's not in doubt. Their military response must be proportionate, and we continue to argue strongly that they show constraint in their pursuit of the terrorist operatives of Hamas embedded in the Gaza Strip.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On Friday, the hopes of a permanent ceasefire turned to despair with the continuation of the collective punishment and killing of Palestinian civilians, a large proportion of whom are women and children in what the United Nations are calling unprecedented numbers. Yet the Secretary of State has just said that ceasefire would be, and I quote, premature. Can he clarify whether there is any limit at all of the number of Palestinian civilians that this government supports killing before calling for a permanent ceasefire? And can he explain what he understands to be the long-term plan with regards to Gaza and how this plan is in keeping with international law?
Well, regrettably, it's not the case that Hamas wants a ceasefire. It would be good if that was the case. It's not. They are a terrorist group committed to the destruction of Israel, and they are on record as stating their desire to perpetrate another atrocity on the scale of the 7th of October. So while that is the fact, the consequence inevitably is an Israeli military response. We support their right to protect their sovereignty. We implore them to show constraint and to avoid civilian casualties. And attendant to that, we will argue for a further humanitarian pause to allow humanitarian aid to flow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Israel is clearly undertaking an act of cleansing of the entire population of Gaza. It is illegal within international law. It in no way is a proportionate response to the appalling events of October the 7th. So could I ask him, what does he think Israel's long-term objective is? Is it to expel the entire population of Gaza into Egypt? And could he say, what is the role and purpose and military objective of British military participation in the whole area? And can he assure us that there are no British soldiers on the ground in Gaza?
Speaker, unsurprisingly, I don't share his assessment or his view of the context. And of course, it's clear that the Israeli objective is to defend itself against the terrorist group of Hamas.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Earlier in this UQ, the Minister said he was forthright and the British government was forthright in the condemnation of the atrocities of the 7th of October, which everyone agrees with. When is the British government going to be forthright in its condemnation of the murder of innocent Palestinian children? 15,000 people have died so far. At the start of this conflict, half of the Gazan population were children. When is the British government going to call that out and say enough is enough?
Madam Speaker, we continue to argue for constraint and restraint and the application of military power according to humanitarian law, and we will continue to do that.
Shalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. James Lee from Save the Children, the director of the occupied Palestinian territories, just returned from a 5-day trip in Gaza. He writes, "A young child might not understand what is happening, but they see destruction around them. They see their homes, schools, communities destroyed. They hear everything that's happening around them. The airstrikes, the cries for help. They feel the terror, the insecurity, the helplessness. Many members and right honourable members this afternoon have raised the issue of innocent children being killed. Innocent children who have no cause in what's going on. We cannot watch while this continues. So does the Minister agree that unless we work towards a definitive ceasefire, that is the only way to sustainable peace in the region?
Well, Madam Secretary, she makes she draws a very painful allusion to the view of Save the Children, and of course I should say that that's why a large portion of our increased aid budget is going to UNICEF to support children affected by this. And of course, we would all like a de-escalation and a ceasefire, but while Hamas remains intent on perpetrating another atrocity like the 7th of October, it's very hard to see how there can be no other response than a military one in terms of Israel defending its sovereignty.
Patrick Grady.
Mr. Speaker, the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has issued a call for evidence regarding possible breaches of international humanitarian law in Israel and Palestine. Is the UK Government in a position to, and indeed will it be, contributing to that investigation?
Not at this stage, but of course we will continue to take note.
Blackened by mould, eaten by worms and mulled by stray dogs. That was the fate, Madam Deputy Speaker, of 4 premature babies who medical staff were forced to leave behind after being forced to evacuate the Al Nasser hospital in just 30 minutes by the Israeli military. Just what was the crime of these 4 vulnerable premature babies who were left to an unimaginable fate? And just how does the Minister plan on telling me that a humanitarian pause helped them when a ceasefire would have saved them?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, he talks painfully about a humanitarian impact. Of course, the tragedy is that Hamas does not want a ceasefire, and therefore the conflict will surely continue.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I accept that Hamas is a terrorist organisation and that their infrastructure needs to be dismantled so that they can't commit any more atrocities. But that doesn't justify the unrelenting bombing that we saw return to Gaza over the weekend. Has the government satisfied itself that Israeli bombing is precision bombing against terrorist targets? And if it hasn't been able to satisfy itself of that, why isn't it calling for a ceasefire?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we have argued and we will continue to argue for constraint, and the whole House will share the anguish he expresses about the humanitarian and the human impact. But we continue to make the argument to Israel that they must be restrained and they must follow international humanitarian law.
Qureshi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UN Secretary General recently said, "We are witnessing a killing of civilians that is unparalleled and unprecedented in any conflict since he has been a Secretary General. Over 16,000 Palestinians are dead, 70% are women and children. Hospitals are being flooded with influx of dead bodies, over 41,000 injured, 84,000 people with diarrhea, 100,000 with acute respiratory things, thousands of people trapped under the rubble. 80% of the Gazan population is now internally displaced. There are bombs everywhere in Gaza. There is no safe place for these people to go to. So when will the government ask for a definitive ceasefire and allow access for humanitarian?
Speaker, she paints a very moving picture of the terrible human cost, and that is why we have continued and we will continue with renewed effort to call for a humanitarian pause so that a greater degree of aid can flow.
Stephen Farron.
Thanks very much. I'm a strong advocate of full and proper ceasefire as a prelude to a wider political process. However, work has to be done to create the conditions for a ceasefire, including the potential provision of security guarantees. So what plans does the government have to discuss with international partners the creation of some form of peacekeeping or monitoring presence, either under the basis of the United Nations or some form of ad hoc arrangement, with, including in particular the Arab states, in order to provide some form of confidence-building measures?
Madam Secretary, the Honourable Gentleman makes a very interesting point, and I think we are certainly using our regional network of diplomacy and diplomatic presence to discuss regional solutions that may involve other Arab states, because the political settlement will depend on a long-term sustainable regional support, and whatever the outcome might be.
Manjeet Singh Desai.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to see an end to the violence in Gaza, which is what I recently voted for along with Labour colleagues. After the end of the fragile ceasefire last week, we desperately need the UK government to work with international allies and push for peace, with the release of all hostages and the end of the killing of thousands of innocent Palestinians. So, Minister, as winter sets in, does he share my concerns about a potential outbreak of cholera and other waterborne diseases and the risk of starvation and dehydration? And what steps is the government taking to avert that ongoing crisis?
Yes, Madam Speaker, we are acutely aware of the manifold health risk in Gaza. That's why we have tripled our aid budget, and a lot will be channelled through OCHA, UNICEF and UNRWA to attend to the risks posed by cholera and other diseases. And of course we continue to push for peace, and a humanitarian pause would be the first step towards that.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the 30th of October, the IDF evacuation order directed Gazan civilians southward, triggering mass internal displacement, which the IDF said was for their own safety. On the 1st of December, the IDF ordered people to leave districts in Khan Yunis where many had gone for their own safety, saying they were in dangerous combat zones. Given the IDF military action now stretches from Gaza City in the north to Rafah in the south, does the Minister agree with the UN's Volga Turk that there is no safe place in Gaza? And does he agree that only a permanent ceasefire can end this collective punishment of the Palestinians?
Speaker, she makes a good point, but I mean, tragically, the reason is that Hamas have often sought to embed themselves amongst civilian infrastructure, and as long as that is the case, then tragedy will ensue. The solution is a de-escalation, a defeat of Hamas, and in the first instance, a humanitarian pause to improve humanitarian access.
Mari Rimmer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Allegations of breaches of international humanitarian law should always be treated with the utmost seriousness. Assessing specific allegations is a proper task of lawyers and competent international courts. Does the Minister recognise with Labour that the International Criminal Court jurisdiction must address the conduct of all parties in Gaza?
Well, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have long been on the record for calling for all parties to abide by international humanitarian law.
Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Israeli authorities are now bombing South Gaza, the very area is asked civilians to reach to be safe. Does the Minister agree with me that the supply of arms to Israeli government must be suspended, given the serious violations amounting to crime under international law are being committed?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we support, and we're on record of supporting, Israel's right to defend itself, and therefore our relationship with Israel is in accordance with that. But of course that doesn't mean that we don't at the same time argue for a de-escalation and a humanitarian pause and a return to peace.
Hal Williams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UN Children's Fund says that Gaza is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. Now, France has offered places in its hospitals to treat the most severely injured children. Will the Minister now make a similar offer to the injured children of Gaza?
And that's why a significant portion of our humanitarian aid, which we've trebled to 60 billion, will be channelled through UNICEF to attend to the need of children affected.
Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We know that more than 15,000 Palestinians have been killed, and 70% of whom are women and children, and there are still thousands unaccounted for under rubble. Now, the events of the last 2 days demonstrate that a pause in fighting was never going to be sufficient. So I ask the Minister, what on earth will it take for his government to call for a permanent ceasefire on all sides to prevent the bombardment of Gaza's civilian infrastructure, including its hospitals, schools, or what's left of them, should I say, but also water facilities?
Of course, she's correct that the pause wasn't sufficient to meet all of the humanitarian needs, but that doesn't stop us arguing for a further pause, because, of course, that is the first step to a more sustainable path towards peace.
Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I must say, the Minister comes across like a passive observer as the further horror unfolds. I wish he would use his agency in his role, because 1.8 million people in Gaza have been forcibly displaced. People were told to go south to avoid the bombing. Now Israel is indiscriminately bombing areas there. The UN says there is no safe place in Gaza. Above all, this is a war on children. So how many more children have to die before the government adds its name to the growing list of countries around the world calling for an immediate and sustained ceasefire?
I would say gently to the honourable gentleman, in actuality, this is a war on Hamas.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Surely the events after the weekend have shown that a temporary pause in cessation of hostilities is just not enough. And what we do need, as many others have said, and including the British public as a whole, want to see a permanent ceasefire. They want to see the release of hostages. They want to see a sustainable, credible political process so that we have safe and secure Palestinian states alongside a safe and secure Israeli state. But what in particular has come across at this statement is that there's absolutely no plan from the government. But I would like to ask this very quick question, Madam Deputy Speaker. How many UK citizens and UK visa holders are still remaining evacuation from Gaza?
One humanitarian pause is not, of course it's not enough, but that's why we're arguing for another. And that's an important part of our sense of there being a long-term obligation on us all to argue for a sustainable, long-term two-state solution.
Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Without a ceasefire or a truce in place, there is no safe zone in Gaza. And I've expressed concerns before about the inadequacy of al-Mawazi as a safe zone without any infrastructure or ability to get aid to innocent civilians. Given that the bombardment is happening and there seems to be no place for people to go, no hope for innocent civilians, does he share my worries that the constant bombardment is going to drive the besieged people of Gaza into the arms of extremists? And what representations are the government making to the Israeli government to express those concerns?
Frankly, the solution would be for Hamas to come out of their tunnels and surrender, and for Gaza to return to normality, and that's what we hope might happen.
Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, I accept that Hamas is a terrorist organisation, but children, journalists, aid workers and innocent civilians have died and continue to be under threat in Gaza. There is now a potential outbreak of air and waterborne diseases. Surely it is now time for the UK government to finally call for a ceasefire as they work towards the release of all hostages and a political peace process.
She makes a good point about disease, and that's why a large portion of the tripled humanitarian fund of £60 million will be focused on the prevention of contagious diseases channeled through the three UN agencies.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We all want the killing to stop, and if we do get to a point where there is an end to the violence on a long-term basis, what guarantees can be obtained by the UK government that the many people who have been displaced will be allowed to return, and there will be sufficient infrastructure in place to ensure they have something to return to.
So he makes a good point about post-war reconstruction and the return of civilians. And of course, I think the UK will be at the heart of the international response that will attend to that.
Sarah Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A night of utterly relentless bombardment, the worst of the war so far. Those are the words of a UNICEF spokesperson this morning in Khan Yunis in the south of Gaza, where 1.8 million Palestinians are now trapped as Israeli bombs rain down on them. Ordered to flee the north, now slaughtered in the south. Nowhere is safe in Gaza. Even as UN experts warn of a grave risk of genocide, this government continues to give its full support to Israel, calling for pauses in the slaughter, not a permanent ceasefire and an end to the slaughter. So I ask, is the Minister happy to be part of a government so deeply complicit in the horrors being inflicted on the Palestinian people?
Well, we continue to be forthright in our support for the absolute right of Israel to defend its people and its sovereignty. And the tragedy that has unfolded following the Hamas terrorist abomination on the 7th of October, of course, brings pain to all sides. But we will continue to be forthright in our commitment to Israel security and ultimately, hopefully, Palestinian statehood and a long-term sustainable peace in the Middle East.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are many of us who absolutely recognise Israel's right to defend itself, who recognise that Hamas and their approach is a barrier to a lasting peace solution, who also absolutely despair that the government and the ministers' calls for restraint on behalf of the Israeli government is being so ignored. So does he agree with me that the international community needs to make it absolutely clear to every combatant in this conflict that the International Criminal Court are watching, that people will be held to account for their conduct, and that him simply saying we call for humanitarian law to be followed is not enough? People will be held to account for the conduct of this war.
Exactly. He's stating the fact of the matter. I mean, international humanitarian law, which we expect all sides to follow, is there to be upheld.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The humanitarian situation is escalating. We know that the disease burden is rising at such a pace that without intervention, this will end up as a real humanitarian catastrophe. So what discussions is he having with the World Health Organization as well as the UN to follow what the aid agencies are calling for, and that is a ceasefire so they can get on top of the disease burden across Gaza?
She makes a good point about the disease burden, and what we are arguing for is increased flow of humanitarian support and medical supplies, not just through land, but also maybe via a seaborne route, and that's something we'll continue to do.
Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So many of my constituents continue to contact me to press the government regarding its actions towards securing a ceasefire and to help the suffering of innocent civilians in Gaza. So to that end, can I ask the Minister, what recent discussions has the Foreign Secretary held to urge Israel not to besiege or blockade Gaza, to comply with international law and protect innocent lives? Minister.
The Foreign Secretary has been hugely active, engaging with many different nations, and of course he was in Israel just some 10 days ago, making the point that we must ensure that the humanitarian impact of this conflict is constrained and limited.
James Murray.
Madam Deputy Speaker, in Gaza, innocent Palestinians are facing an unimaginable nightmare with a humanitarian catastrophe and thousands of civilians, including children, being killed. Further to his remarks to my honourable friend, can the Minister provide more detail about what the UK government is doing to urge Israel not to besiege or blockade Gaza, to comply with international law and to protect innocent lives?
Pointing out, Madam Deputy Speaker, that all sides must abide by international humanitarian law, that ultimately there cannot be a military solution to political problems in the Middle East. Clearly the terrorist group of Hamas, we hope will not have a political role representing the Palestinian people, but de-escalation and peace must come first.
I thank the Minister for answering the urgent question.